Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 19th of August. Today we're looking at some really important developments, beginning with Pokrovsk, then looking at New York, moving on to areas in Luhansk, and finishing off with some important updates from the Kursk offensive. And so before we get into the actual changes, I want to thank you all so much for 40,000 subscribers. I really can't believe we reached this point, and I'm just going to continue working until we reach 50,000 and so on. So just thank you all again. And now let's get into the actual updates. So in yellow, you could see the latest advance by the Russian forces that occurred over the past 24 hours. You can see that they captured an area amounting to 1.3 square kilometers. And this area is of particular importance because the Russians have been able to pass through two villages and reach the southern tip of Zhevitnya. So based on reporting from yesterday, we're all aware of the Russians being able to infiltrate into Novozhelane, and this occurred due to the Russians capturing Zhelane over the past week and using it as a forward hub to then continue advancing southwards through this highly elevated hill, and from there overlooking into the valley on which these two villages in the Red Square are located. And so pretty quickly, the Ukrainians were unable to hold onto their positions. Again, they're on low-lying valleys with not many supporting villages nearby, supply lines constantly under fire. The Ukrainians now, for the first time since the beginning of the Kursk offensive, actually reporting on an increase in Russian air sorties. And so now the Russians are finding a way to balance between the strikes towards Ukrainian columns advancing and to support their own offensives in Donbass. And so we're seeing that manifest now in these two villages. And so the Russian forces simply continued with their previous momentum, were able to infiltrate into these residential areas and avoid any sort of large-scale fighting by quickly advancing, and if we're going to measure the extent of it, advancing around 2 kilometers southwards and reaching this southern tip based on this video here, showing Russian soldiers raising flags in the ruins of the village, because there are a lot of houses here that have been not totally decimated, but have definitely suffered damage due to some recent Russian shelling. Now, what's important isn't just the capture in and of itself, but what it opens up for the Russians, because as you can see in the surrounding regions, there are not many villages, especially to the west. There's essentially no more villages between the current Russian spearhead in Zhevitnya and the E50 highway located to the west. And that's an area spanning 4.6 kilometers. It's just a completely open area with some trenches in between scattered. And this gives the Russians access to actually cut off this road that is very important, because if you zoom out, you can see that it connects to Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk, then passes just north of Selidove, and makes its way all the way to some Ukrainian frontline positions in Karlivka, and then to the wider defense line being built by the Ukrainians that I always talk about within the western bank of the Vavcha River. And so that would be a massive artery for Ukraine's frontline activities being totally cut off. And you could look at Mykolaiivka, for instance, and the Russians are only right now 1.3 kilometers away from the gas station near the highway. So that is very concerning. And more generally, if you're looking at the area directly south of the Russian vector of advance, and it is all located on a rather highly elevated ridge, and the Ukrainians don't have any static positions of significance that could hold on to it for a large period of time. The hope that the Ukrainians had is that they would be able to just keep the Russians at bay by dragging out the fighting and increasing attrition within Zhelane. But once that failed, they weren't really prepared for a fallback line in Novozhelane, and so now all the fields to the south are just more open and can be utilized by the Russians. And taking over those sort of heights would give the Russians control of positions overlooking the valley on which Selidove is located on, because Selidove and Mykolaiivka, besides their sort of slag heaps surrounding them, which really are important positions for the Ukrainians to defend, you can see Selidove is located in the middle of the Solona River Valley, so it is a really low-lying position. Now, the other issue for the Ukrainians is due to the Vavcha River. Now, due to this advance in Zhevitnya, you can see that the Ukrainians that are still holding on to forward positions in Komishivka or Ptiche over here, they are now exposed, because from the east, of course, you have the river. They're not crossing that anymore, and the Russians are actually reaching all the way to the riverbank at this point. So there's pressure from the east, and then the more immediate attack is coming from the west. And these villages that you see marked with these lines, they are located on rather low elevation. All of the villages that you see that the Ukrainians hold on to, at least the ones that I'm marking here, they are overlooked by the Russian positions that have either already been captured or could be captured based on the area where I'm drawing these two arrows. The same area that I talked about as a means by which the Russians can overlook Selidove. In a more immediate area, it could actually overlook the western bank of the Vavcha River located over here. So not only is there a flanking threat, because you could already see how there's sort of salient is being formed, but also the elevation threat is definitely present. And this could be enough to squeeze out the Ukrainians from a large portion of frontline villages and local strong points that really would have been impenetrable for the Russians had they not been able to infiltrate the Vavcha River from the north and had to just directly attack head on from these regions. That would have been so much worse when it comes to attrition rates. And so the Russian forces have been able to probably save thousands of men in terms of just general casualties killed and wounded by being able to circumvent this massive Ukrainian defense line over here and just continue flanking it from other directions, forcing the Ukrainians to retreat without maximizing their full potential. Now, moving on to New York, I want to talk about the events here in more detail. And I think that over the next few hours, we may receive some clarification from Ukrainian sources like Deep State surrounding the exact situation here. But so far, there haven't been that many murmurs from the Ukrainians about the situation here. They're just all generally in agreement about a general Ukrainian retreat. But so far, not enough clarification as to whether the entirety of the town has been captured by the Russians already. A lot of Russian sources have already claimed that they fully secured the town. And so for now, we're only going to stick as to what's verified from both sides. And so we know some of this already because we have these markers in yellow that are from yesterday's video indicating advances of 4.7 square kilometers. And then to the west here, what is this, 0.9 square kilometers respectively. And so if we zoom in, you see that the Russians were able to advance along school number 38 in northwestern New York, along Sadova Street, made their way all the way to this Kryvyi Toretsk riverbank, cross over it, and actually reach the first houses of Nelipivka here. And they met in conjunction with this rather important vector, which came originally from the center of New York, where the Russians were able to infiltrate in a rather fast pace a couple of days ago. And then from there, circumvent the positions in this local factory, advance along the rail line in some residential areas, and make it all the way to the Zalizhnya River just south of Nelipivka. So now you have these two significant Russian avenues that are about to conjoin, and there are a lot of questions surrounding whether there are still Ukrainian forces present in this factory. For now, I'm marking it as a gray zone, but we don't know whether they were all able to make it out in time, and now the Russians are probably conducting combing operations in this rather large facility, which on its own, if you try to attack it, would be extremely difficult. But you can see how its importance really became more superfluous given the really weak flanks that the Ukrainians had to the east and west. So now, really just out of that nature, they had to withdraw from it. Same thing with a lot of these other villages in eastern New York. We don't know if the Russians fully cleared out regions like this, for instance, but they're currently conducting combing operations. That is just a preliminary assessment. And then the other sort of big piece of questioning for us is what's going on with the salient here, because you have the road that connects Zalizhnya from the northeast to Nelipivka to the southwest, and this road, everything just southeast of it that the Ukrainians hold, is extremely exposed because you have on both directions Russians operating and able to advance and close off the salient at a rather quick pace. And so then we have questions as to whether the Ukrainians are still here and are still in some sort of compromised position, whether it be near these ponds or forested regions or trenches. All of them, they need to be sort of evacuated at a rather quick pace at this point if they haven't already. And then the sort of logical fallback line would include some of the trenches here that you see marked in yellow. I will add in additional trenches to give you guys a full understanding of all the defenses built by the Ukrainians here. And in doing so, they would have to cede some land in Nelipivka and towards Leonivka. And so a big issue that we're going to see is in relation to the Zabalka suburb of Toretsk, which is the southernmost district of the city, sort of acting as its own town in reality because it is really cut off from the center of Toretsk due to this massive mine in between. And so now we're seeing the unity between the New York and Zalizhnya axes, and together those two avenues for the Russians really would make a potent force to put pressure onto the defense line on the perimeter of Zabalka. So really keep an eye out for the developments here, because if we're to zoom in, then you'll see that once the salient closes to the south, the Russians will only be about 1.7 kilometers away from this district. And then from the Zalizhne direction, they're only about 1 kilometer away. And the really future of this front has been sort of revealed to us due to this Russian capture here. So the Russian forces were able to slightly advance past the diagonal road that we always discuss that was supposed to serve as a temporary Ukrainian defense line, but the Russians were able to rather quickly breach it after fighting in residential areas nearby. They advanced 600 meters into this specific Artema mine, that is what it is referred to, and its subsequent slag heap. And we have the photo here of the Russians raising their flag on the Artema mine. And this is confirmation that one of the most significant heights for the Ukrainians at the front line has been taken over by the Russians. And so now this specific point would give the Russians an amazing location to just specifically overlook all of the surrounding regions, especially Zabalka, located on low elevation, especially the trenches located to its south, and also to give them this access to this really massive forestry region, because there are a lot of DRG-esque Russian forces operating here, whether they are Axe Wagner mercenaries or just certain detachments of Russian brigades involved in DRG operations, and they will really have a field day operating within these dense forested regions that still have all of their foliage and could be used in order to undermine the eastern flank of Zabalka, begin actual raids into Toretsk city itself as a result. And so this could be a big threat to the integrity of the entire city based on this capture here of this mine. Now, at the same time, you're seeing that the Ukrainians still are lucky because they have control over another local mine, the Nova mine, and its Terrakon. And so this one is only about like 1 kilometer away from the front line, and it's also separated by a forested region. And so it provides the Ukrainians some support, but it could also become an area where DRGs cross through the forest to begin assaulting and harassing Ukrainian defenders. Now, another slag heap that is really important and was supposed to serve as a linchpin for the Ukrainians in their defense was the Severnaya mine, which is the one over here, and its Terrakon. Now, it's been nearly completely cut off due to this Russian advance deep into Pivnishne near the actual city of Toretsk itself, plus the pressure coming in from Lenina Street a bit to the east. And so the salient here is not sustainable, and you're going to see a similar fate with this mine over here where the Russians will be able to take it. And taking over this particular mine would first of all clear up all these other trenches nearby, and would also give the Russians a perfect line of sight to other forested regions and some areas deeper into the heartland of Toretsk itself. Now, when it comes to elevation, of course, those heights on the Terrakon are the most important elevation-wise, but when it comes to general trends, when it comes to ridges, then you have the Pivnishne Ridge, which is a really high elevation, and it actually extends pretty deep into eastern Toretsk. So that region that the Ukrainians are currently defending near this highway that I'm going to mark in red for you guys, this area is not actually on that low of an elevation. So besides the mines, the Ukrainians aren't at a massive loss near the front line. But when you go a bit eastwards, the rest of Toretsk and also Zabalka and nearby regions, including supply lines, they're all on a really, really low valley because the Toretsk River passes through nearby. And so there's just a massive river valley here, and that is a huge threat once the heights are taken over completely by the Russians. I should also add that the Russian unit that was involved in capturing the mine, the Artema mine, is the 1st Slavic Motor Rifle Brigade, DPR unit, one of its most experienced brigades. I believe that was previously serving around Avdiivka, but maybe it also had certain elements around Seversk, but now it's been fully committed to here, and we've been reporting on that for over a month now. Now, moving up northwards, we're going to look at an update from the Luhansk region. We haven't really paid attention to it much, but there have been a few updates from Pischane and also from Makivka, where the Russians have continued with their offensive operations. If we zoom in, we'll see there are some new geolocations confirming advances, although there is fierce Ukrainian resistance. The Russians in recent days took over 1.7 square kilometers. So here you can see actually, based on this location, that on August 17th, the 3rd Battalion of the 115th Brigade, their FPV struck various Russian houses and dugouts in eastern Makivka. You're seeing a lot of these compilations, and within them, a lot of specific instances where Russian soldiers individually are spotted and taken out as a result of these drones. And so this is an area where the Ukrainians definitely do have an advantage when it comes to the amount of FPVs they're sending in. And that's because the 115th Brigade is really active around here. We know that they were out of the fighting for like a year until they were introduced back to the Pokrovsk fronts around Ocheretine in spring, I believe it was. And since then, they've been moved towards here to sort of act as a sort of line solidifier. And they've been joined by the Azov Brigade, 3rd Assault Brigade. They're also defending generally in this region. And then you have this other video from August 17th of the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Brigade. And they struck a Russian house that is actually west of the Zherebets River. So we have the first ever confirmation that the Russians crossed over the river. And this is in an area where it is rather narrow. But again, this means that the Russians already have a foothold and are planning to fully clear out the village, both even on the western bank now, trying to get control over the final residential areas. And then they'll actually have a means by which to begin expanding past the Zherebets River. But the pace here is rather slow, and that's because it is a lower priority for the Russians. You can tell based on the amount of advances and also the amount of units allocated to this region, it is definitely not at the top of Russian priorities. Meanwhile, in Pischane, I don't think I covered this, so I will now. We did receive updates from Deep State, I believe it was the 14th of August, where they were able to secure nearly 7.5 square kilometers. Then yesterday night, they claimed that the Russians were able to secure another rather small region just southwest of the town. And so you could see how the outskirts of Pischane are being cleared out by the Russians. That includes clearing out whatever Ukrainian remnants are resisting in Tabaivka or in nearby trenches, which are now being taken over. And the next step would also be to secure the southern flank, which includes areas near Berestove. Doing so would give the Russians a really strong spearhead, a really strong salient that is resistant to any sort of flanking assault because the flanks are so wide and have control over key hills and trenches. And that would then give the Russians a springboard to either advance in the northwestern direction towards this open field area, which has a really massive hill, which could help the Russians strategically when it comes to advancing deeper and overlooking areas near the Oskil River. And they could also do the same thing with hills further south here that are also on high elevation and overlook some nearby Ukrainian villages, because these areas really are large gaps in the Ukrainian line. They don't have too many troops to deal with the defense here, and they're not that dense in fortifications. And so this Pischane operation by the Russians really has been able to expose the gaping hole in the lines. But again, due to this being a lower priority, the extent of the advances is also lower. So now moving on to the Kursk offensive. Just to begin, Zelensky today, he claimed that the Ukrainians have control over 1,250 square kilometers in their entirety of the offensive, including taking control over 92 settlements. Now, based on my own assessment, which is based on, an aggregate of reports and geolocations, then you could see here that I have 660 square kilometers plus another 40 square kilometers. It's around 700 square kilometers that are under Ukrainian control with 100% certainty, or close to it. Some of these areas may be fluid, but a lot of the gray zone you see marked as neither red nor light blue. And so if you include the gray zone, then you could probably reach 1,200 if you're stretching it. And same thing with the villages. If you add up all the areas where there may have previously been engagements, then eventually you could reach 92. But again, you can't really compare Ukrainian soldiers in an area like Sverdlikovo, where they are completely operating in the open, interacting with local residents, and actually have large convoys, to areas where they no longer are in control and the Russians have pushed them back. That is simply not the case. But again, if we're looking a bit to the west, this is an area where all of the attention has been shifted towards, and this is an area that actually does amount to around 650 square kilometers. And so if the Ukrainians got control over it, then they actually would have the total that Zelensky announced in recent remarks. And so just as an update about the bridges here, all three have been destroyed. The one in Glushkovo first, then the one in Zhivanoy, and then finally Karij. As of last night, Russian sources confirmed its destruction, so did Ukrainians, and a photo was posted showing that it was just completely decimated as a result of a Ukrainian airstrike, either using the JDAM extended range kit or perhaps even the French AASM 250 Hammer glide bomb, which again, they've been using these rather frequently to target these bridges and have had success in doing so. If we're zooming out now, the Russian forces, they've been forced to diversify and have built at least 2 pontoon bridges, one near Glushkovo. Over here, you have the geolocation, and this was marked in satellite imagery as of August 17th. And then there's another one east of Zhivanoy, also important, and the Russians are using these as alternatives. I don't know how much heavy equipment they even need to move, because there probably wasn't that much in the first place. But in terms of personnel, then yeah, pontoon bridges will suffice for the final evacuation of the civilian population. And then it remains to be seen whether the Russians will try to also evacuate their troops from this area at the same time, or whether they try to hold on to some of these larger settlements like Zhivanoy and Glushkovo for an extended period of time, using the pontoons, again, as a means by which to continue communication and supply. There are also small boats that can be utilized. These rivers are, in width between 50 and 100 meters. So boats definitely are able to be utilized, but then it's a question of whether the Ukrainians will continue to fire towards the pontoon bridges and make it a nightmare for the Russians to continue setting them up. Looking at the actual frontline update, I think we have pretty good proof that backs up Deep State's claims from yesterday surrounding the capture of Snegorsk by the Ukrainians. So this is a video that was released by Ukrainian sources, or it was shared by them at least, and it shows the Russians shelling a house in Vishnevka. You could also see this exact fire on the specific location in satellite imagery, and so there actually was some fire that occurred here due to the Russians spotting a Ukrainian squad infiltrating into here and, of course, striking them. Now, Rybar also acknowledged this, but on their mapping, they still have Vishnevka and Snegorsk as under Russian control, so they're implying that this Ukrainian raid was actually repelled by the Russians. So far, we don't have any confirmation of that, but Snegorsk itself, if the Ukrainians are in Vishnevka, then they would have had to pass through this particular village. And so for now, I'm marking it as under Ukrainian control, while Byakhovo turns into an area in the gray zone. At the same time, satellite imagery from the 18th of August also shows us that there's really deep clashes occurring within this forested region just north of Vishnevka and southwest of Korenovo. What this shows to us is that the Ukrainians have likely been able to pass through this height over here in some of the nearby forested areas. So they may already be operating in these fields and have actually been able to send in DRGs on foot into this forested region where the Russians are trying to shell them. And there could also be some sort of Ukrainian shelling targeting Russian forces in the same region. In any case, what this means is that the fighting is rather close to Krasnoyarsk, and that this sort of land connection on road between Korenovo and the entire southern bank of the Siem River is now severed. There's no way to do it through a land-based connection like this. That's simply not feasible. The only way to connect are through those pontoons and boats. It also means that the Ukrainians are continuing with preparations to begin attacking Korenovo, and the way they're doing it is through gradually getting control over forested regions and then using that as a vector through which to put pressure on multiple flanks and conduct raids deep towards Russian lines in these various towns around here. And so that's just a continual process, and we know that the Russians are still targeting Ukrainian vehicles near the entrance to the town. That has not ceased. The Russian response here is quick when it comes to spotting various vehicles out in the open, especially near this settlement. So here we have a video showing the Russian reconnaissance spotting a Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle as it was evacuating Ukrainian squad from a tree line that is very, very close to Korenovo. As that was going on, it was struck by artillery, and you could see at the end of the video that the vehicle was static and there was smoke rising, so it was probably destroyed. At the same time, we still see combat-related fires in Olgovka, so the clashes continue over there. We also have some reporting from Russian sources about a large volume of Ukrainian FPVs drones targeting various Russian logistical assets between Ryelsk and to the east Lgov. So this entire E38 highway is under a lot of bombardment from Ukrainian drones, especially as of last night. So the Russian electronic warfare systems really are working hard to try to repel that. And it's about 20 kilometers away from the front line when you look at it. So these are rather long-range FPV drones when it comes to the extent of their sorties. And also there's reports about Ukrainians using mine-clearing artillery. It may not be confirmed yet, but what is being mentioned by Russian sources such as Romanov is that they may have the capacity to actually launch these mine clearers towards the highway. And that could be a big threat for any sort of Russian logistical assets coming through, especially when you look at it, the Ukrainian sort of mines that they're using that are fired from the 155 millimeter howitzers, those mine clearing submunitions, they explode automatically at the very least after 4 hours. It could be as much as 48 hours after they're launched. But again, there's a time that's rather quickly after they're landed. At that point, they actually begin to explode. And that could be a big issue for the Russian forces as they're trying to utilize these roads to continue sending in resupply into this region. So really keep an eye out for whether the Ukrainians try to do that. And I say this because in one of the earlier Pentagon shipments from, I think it was January of 2024, it was announced that the Americans would send 10,000 of these remote anti-tank mines that are within the 155 millimeter shell. They have 9 within the shell when they actually land. And so I don't know if that's actually being implemented, but it was mentioned as a potential. So keep an eye out for that. And that's really all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.